exciting opportunity to explore some of the ways in which he made advancements, and then also to take those areas up to the current day to try and give you a bit of a feel about how exciting these fields were at their start, and then to show you how exciting these fields of color evolution continue to be. So there's absolutely no way that I would be able to cover all of the work which has been done by Wallace. This man was a real polymath. So today I'm just going to focus on a couple of really key areas. So I'm going to focus on warning coloration, floral mimicry, before going on to look at startle displays. So warning coloration. For so many of us, this seems really like common sense. The idea that an animal can use coloration to warn predators that I'm not good to eat, or I contain a toxin. We're taught this at school nowadays, but actually there was a time in which this was a really revolutionary idea. But to really understand what an incredible idea this was at the time of Wallace, we're going to have to go back in time. So we're going back now to 1867. So this was a really big year in the UK. So many different things happened. For example, we had Lister, who first of all put forward his ideas about the use of antiseptic during surgery. We had the first stone laid for the Royal Albert Hall. And perhaps most importantly, in my opinion, we also had Cadbury's, who released their first ever range of drinking cocoa. So this was an exciting year to be in the UK. However, in one particular corner of the UK, one person wasn't very happy. And this person was Darwin. He had a problem. More specifically, he had a problem about caterpillars. My difficulty is, why are caterpillars sometimes so beautifully and artistically colored? So this might not seem to us like a serious issue, but at the time, for Darwin, this was a real problem. At the time, Darwin was building on his theories of natural selection, and the way that he built colour into this was mainly on the basis of sexual selection, which is something which is very easy to argue with something like these butterflies that you can see here. It's very easy to argue that in the case like this, you have these incredible wing patterns developing as individuals choose mates with more and more elaborate coloration. However, for adults, when you look at caterpillars, like this individual here, you also get the beautiful colors and, in many cases, amazing patterns as well. However, these individuals are definitely not under sexual selection. Therefore, what's going on, and how will Darwin be able to kind of plug this hole in his theory of evolution? Fortunately for Darwin, however, this was a brilliant year for understanding color science. So just a few years earlier, Bates had put forward a whole range of work which later went on to underpin a theory which we know now as Batesian mimicry, by which you have certain individuals who are toxic and certain individuals who are not toxic. And what you see is the non-toxic individuals beginning to mimic the toxic individuals in color and form. So he seemed like a man with answers about this phenomenon of coloration. And so he's exactly the man that Darwin went to. Unfortunately for Darwin, however, he was out of ideas and redirected him to Wallace. Wallace had a habit of being able to think outside the box. With a very novel suggestion for the time. He suggested that the bright colours that we see in caterpillars could enable birds to recognise the prey as something which is not palatable and not fit for consumption, because he points out that for a caterpillar, may be very well being a toxic or poisonous caterpillar, but if you're going to get killed while the bird discovers that, then that's really a very poor defense. So having a color which could tell the birds to avoid you would be very useful. Also, in the same letter, he goes on to describe great tits as the great destroyers of caterpillars, which I just think is a wonderful description and has made me look at great tits in a slightly different way. So again, for us, this seems like a very simple suggestion. However, this at the time was really groundbreaking because although mimicry had been shown by Bates, as I discussed earlier, the advertisement of unpalatability had not been suggested at all. And quite how groundbreaking this suggestion was is shown by the way that Darwin responds in his letter to Wallace. He says that I have never heard of anything more ingenious than your suggestion, which really just highlights how groundbreaking this was at the time. And what's more, Wallace didn't leave it there. He enlisted the help of a man called John Jenner Weir. So John Jenner Weir was a fascinating man in his own right. Apart from anything else, he was one of the first ever cat judges at the first ever recorded cat show in the UK. But he's perhaps better known for his work with Wallace on caterpillars. So fortunately for Wallace, John Jenner Weir had an aviary with 10 different species of small birds in it. So what he did then was to collect a whole range of different types of UK caterpillars, some of which were very brightly coloured and brightly patterned, and some of which were very dull, drab colours in greens and browns. And what he found was that caterpillars that were brightly coloured would be avoided by the birds in the aviary, whereas those which were drab colours in greens and browns would be very quickly eaten up. And so with this experiment that he just did in his aviary, in his back garden, we had the first ever evidence for this form of defense in invertebrates. And really, it didn't stop there. This was really the start of a field that we know now as aposematism. And we discovered that actually there's a whole variety of different species that use this type of defense in very, very different ways. However, what's also been discovered is that there is just so much to learn about this incredible defense that we are still very much only scratching the surface all these years later, trying to understand exactly how and why this defense is used. So I just thought I would use, and as an example, this really lovely study from 2006. I wasn't involved in the study, I just think it's a really beautiful study. So in this study, they took a range of tits, small birds, with firebugs. And they found that the wild individuals and would act very differently to captive individuals who had never seen the bug. So, but what is even stranger than this is that it seemed to happen on a species-specific manner. So they found that crested tits and coal tits, the individuals who were raised in a laboratory would have to learn how to avoid these firebugs in order to act like the wild individuals, suggesting that this was a learned behavior. Sorry, that was even for blue tits and coal tits. They found that actually they seem to show innate bias. So both the wild individuals and the captive raised individuals showed innate bias to try and avoid firebugs, but it's still not quite certain whether or not this bias is innate to these particular colors or whether it's a overarching kind of neophobia towards anything new. So it's still a really exciting area of research. So going on now to a very different use of colors in animals. So one of my favorite things that Wallace talks about is this incredible phenomenon called floral mimicry. So just about the time of Wallace, there began to be reports of a really strange creature in Southeast Asia. In some cases, it was described as a flower that could get up and attack its prey, whereas in other cases, it was described as a really strange, unusual invertebrate. As you can imagine, Wallace was completely intrigued by this strange animal, which we now know to be something called an orchid mantis. But before we discuss his views on the orchid mantis, it's well worth going back to look at his thoughts and how he described colour as a disguise. And as you'll probably be unsurprised to find out, he had a lot to say about the use of colour to disguise an individual. So this is him talking about animals which are used disguise, that they appear like actors or masqueraders, dressed up and painted for amusement. Does nature descend to imposter or masquerade? We answer, she does not, which is Wallace's absolutely beautiful and lyrical way of saying that it's not the case that that colours have evolved for the sake of evolving, but that actually all the colours that we see have a really specific purpose. He then goes on to talk about the amazing ability of some animals to blend in with their backgrounds. So there were a lot of people writing about this at the time, but he was very forward thinking in the way that he looked at this. Two of the things that he made very clear was, first of all, he was very aware of the fact that predators were likely to have very different visual systems to us, and therefore the prey and how it was camouflaged you had to think about that in context of how it would be seen by a predator. But not only that, also how it would be seen in the context of its environment, which are still two kind of features of this area of science, which are still seen as really important today. And although there were a lot of people who agreed with him at the time, there were a lot of people who also didn't agree with him. At the same time, there were other schools of thought who suggested that perhaps you got plants that were one color and animals that were all the same color because of something in the atmosphere or something in the soil, which would change all of the animals to that particular color. Wallace was very against these ideas and stuck very firmly onto his preferred hypotheses that they were doing it for camouflage. And he pointed to certain examples in order to really prove his point. So first of all was animals that live in environments in which they change their fur in order to match their environment. So like this individual who's white in the winter and then will turn brown in the summer. Or again, he also had a lot of hypotheses on this about the difference in plumage between male birds and female birds. A lot of the attention now is on how colourful birds became more colourful, but he was also interested in the females. And he suggested that their drabness and their dark coloration could be a really clever adaptation to allow the females to be safe while they were nesting and hiding eggs. Although, as Tim Caro points out, this is something which is a really interesting hypothesis which still hasn't been fully explored today, so it's really exciting. But how does this link back to mantises? Well, we've established that he is very keen on understanding the link between predators and prey, and taking into consideration the differences in visual systems to try and understand this. Also, while it took him a very, very long time to get hold of a drawing of an orchid mantis, he did, however, was able to study flowers in Britain. And he writes a lot about what has been termed attractive coloration, and the fact that a lot of the flowers and plants in the UK have adapted to attract, he believed, very specific forms of invertebrates, whereas today there's more of a thought that a lot of the colours are much more generalist than he gives credit to. But he also points out, and he was completely right in this respect, that different flowers, some of them have different markings in order to guide the invertebrate to different locations. So then, when he did finally got hold of a drawing of one of these incredible creatures, which is shown here, it was done by James Wood Mason, taking into account his understanding of kind of camouflage and also his understanding of the markings on different plants, you'll perhaps be unsurprised to find out that he came to the conclusion that this mantis had adapted for each part of its body to represent a different part of a flower. And in this way, the mantis could trick prey into coming close enough to be caught. Now, this is actually a kind of a really radical suggestion. All of the forms of using color for camouflage that we've talked about so far, and like this example of this absolutely amazing moth here, you have a lot of examples of camouflage being used for a moth or an invertebrate to hide and not be detected, or to pretend to be something which is not going to be very good to eat, like this moth here. However, what is far less common is the idea of an animal who uses this kind of form of disguise in order to attract prey towards it, which at the time was a really remarkable idea, and is still a remarkable idea now, because we have a lot of predators, for example, crab spiders, which have coloration which is similar to that of a flower, allowing them to hide in flowers to catch prey. But that's quite a world away from this orchid mantis, who manages to recreate a flower and essentially uses his body as a lure to attract them. But amazingly, the research which has been done recently has shown that the truth behind this kind of form of mimicry is even more remarkable than Wallace may have ever expected. So, following the ideas of Wallace, this particular research group did an incredible job modeling the invertebrate visual systems and then comparing what an invertebrate might see when they look at a orchid mantis to a whole variety of different plants and flowers that are found in its native habitat. And what might be expected is that you would get a direct match with one particular plant being very similar from the perspective of an invertebrate to the orchid mantis. But what they found instead is even more incredible. They found that instead of mimicking a particular plant, the orchid mantis actually has evolved to be almost an average between all the other types of plants, which is really remarkable in itself, and perhaps allows it to attract different types of prey, which it wouldn't if it was more specialized. And it goes on. Even more remarkable than this is the fact that these mantises can be, in the wild, even more successful at attracting invertebrates than flowers are, which is just an incredible feat of evolution. So we have covered so far, we have looked at how an animal can use a coloration to warn away a predator or warn that they're toxic. And we've also gone over how animals can use coloration to hide. So now we're going to go on to the third, and I think most exciting area that Wallace really contributed to in terms of animal coloration. And that is something called Wallace talks about, particularly in terms of the use of phosphorescence, as a way that animals may frighten away their enemies. Now, this is a really exciting idea, the idea that a prey can be aiming to frighten a predator. And that bioluminescence in some animals does appear to be being used to frighten away predators. So taking, for example, this amazing vampire squid, they live in really deep, dark oceans in which something like producing ink would be completely useless. They instead have adapted to luminescence in order to startle an attacker. However, as with most things in nature, it turns out that even this particular defense is even more complicated than we would have guessed, and certainly more complicated than perhaps Wallace would have guessed, in that the cloud of bioluminescence is actually sticky. And it's thought that this should be able to stick to a predator, which in turn feeds into a different hypothesis, um, which suggests that, well, it's called the burglar alarm hypothesis, and it suggests that one use of bioluminescence could be that it attracts bigger predators to come and attack the predator who is bothering the squid. But it doesn't just stop there. As well as this incredible bioluminescent clouds, these squid also have, at the tips of their arms, they have bioluminescence. And it's been suggested that this would allow squids to encourage an attacker to attack one of their arms rather than their body, and allowing the rest of the squid to escape, which kind of highlights how, yes, Wallace was right. Bioluminescence can be used as part of a startle display, but in reality, there are so many other ways in which bioluminescence might be being used in animal defense. So there was a couple more examples that I just really, really wanted to share with you, because I just thought that they were absolutely fascinating. And one of these is a incredible, well, group of millipedes. So there's less than a dozen millipedes on the planet which actually bioluminesce. And it's been suggested that this almost happened as a byproduct. In order to respire, to use oxygen at very high altitudes, certain species of millipedes came up with this incredibly complex process, which one of the byproducts of this was a protein which happens to bioluminesce. And it's been suggested that this has now been selected for and forms an important defense for these creatures, because they are, they come out at night, they're nocturnal, so a lot of the colors that we've talked about on previous slides would be completely useless to the species. Therefore, it's amazing to see an adaptation in a kind of very different way that appears to achieve the same goal. And in fact, researchers took a group of these out, and half of them, they painted them brown, and the other half they allowed to glow. And they did find that indeed the individuals who were glowing were much less likely to be eaten. However, rather than a startle display, this is likely to be an aposematic defense, because instead of the colors coming on quickly and brightly, they come on very slowly when the animal is bothered, and kind of have a general background level, and they advertise the fact that these animals are in fact toxic. So this is the final example of bioluminescence I'm going to talk about before moving on, but I just thought it was a really interesting experiment. So fireflies, you're very well known in terms of their bioluminescence, and it's very well known that the primary function of this bioluminescence is to find a partner, to find a mate. However, researchers noticed that during the day, if one of these was bothered or disturbed, sometimes you would get flashes of bioluminescence, which was taken to suggest that perhaps this was evidence for a startle display. So they then set about carrying out this absolutely remarkable experiment, in my opinion, in which they took crickets and they tethered them next to an array of LEDs. And then they introduced a spider into the arena, and they measured to see whether or not a cricket would be more likely to be eaten by the spider if it was next to a flashing array of LEDs or not. Unfortunately for the crickets, they found that they were more likely to be eaten by the spider if they were next to the flashing array of LEDs. However, when they replaced the cricket with a toxic invertebrate, or an unpalatable invertebrate, they found that the spiders would learn to avoid this toxic invertebrate much more quickly when it was next to the flashing array rather than not, which really highlights how complicated a lot of these, and fascinating a lot of these defenses are, perhaps even more fascinating than Wallace realized. So moving on now from bioluminescence, another feature which Wallace highlighted as something which animals, invertebrates, could use potentially to startle their predators was the attitudes of some insects. And you can see here two examples of attitudes which invertebrates might use to try to protect themselves. And here I have a couple of videos to show you one particularly brilliant example of this, which these videos were very kindly lent to me by Dr. Hannah Rowland, who's done some amazing work on these animals. So these are puss moths. And as you see, when they're bothered, they rear up and they puff out their faces, and then they also have these incredible tail whips as well. So I'll just show you that again. So that's the Startle display, perhaps as Wallace might have seen it. So this kind of area, which he kind of commented on about these attitudes of invertebrates and the way that perhaps a prey can frighten its predators, has now grown into this incredible branch of research, which they're now known as dymatic displays, from the Greek demos, to fear. However, there's still, again, so much we still have to learn about the mechanism behind these displays. How do they work? How effective are they? Are they effective on all predators or only some predators? So there are many groups working on this particular area. However, one in which I just think is a really exciting study system is the mountain katydid. And Dr. Kate Umbers has been doing a lot of really exciting work in this area. And again, she very kindly said that I'd be able to use these videos of her incredible study species. So you should be able to see. So this is a female mountain katydid. And as you can see, it has this incredible defense by which it goes from being dull and cryptic to being wonderfully brightly colored. They also, when they are bothered, release a kind of exudate under their wings, which is thought to be unpalatable to predators. So because of that, Dr. Umbers set out to try and unpick one of these big questions around startle displays. How effective are they against predators who know what they are? Is it the case that these startle displays perhaps work on naive predators and then don't work once the predator understands what they're seeing, or is something else happening? So this is what they set out to do. And this is another interesting video. So this is a pair of Australian magpies, absolutely beautiful creatures. There's an adult in the background, and in the foreground, you might be able to see juvenile, who is in fact picking up one of these mountain katydids and is washing it in the stream, presumably to remove the foul-tasting liquid. So this experiment and a range of other much larger experiments carried out by the Umbers lab have actually shown that the effects of these defenses are largely thought to be dependent on the experience on the predator. So if an individual has never seen these invertebrates before, then they tend to be startled or surprised by the flash of color. However, for animals who have seen it a few times, some of them are able to, like we saw in the previous slides, almost become wise to this defense and know how to get around it. However, it's still not cut and dry. These fascinating defense displays are still an area of real research and debate. There are so many questions, particularly about whether it should be defined as a display or whether it should be defined as the effects that it has on the predators. Also, we still don't know whether or not the prey is tricking the predator. In some cases, you get certain displays with kind of eye spots appearing and all sorts. Or is it the case that the display is simply tapping into kind of enough responses to kind of trigger a startle response rather than actually tricking the predator into thinking that their prey is something dangerous? So overall, I hope that I've demonstrated to you that Wallace has made so many incredible breakthroughs in the fields of warning coloration, floral mimicry, and also startle displays. And at the time, there was a real excitement for these advancements in these really critical evolutionary areas. And hopefully I've also shown you that this excitement is still very much around today. There is still so much to discover, which I'm sure Wallace would still be very excited about were he around today. So, in conclusion, we have come a long way since Wallace, but there is still a long way to go, and it's a really exciting field to be part of. So finally, in the words of Wallace, we must now conclude this very brief outline of one of the most curious chapters in natural history. With that, I would very much like to firstly thank Kate and Hannah for letting me use their videos, and also to thank you all very much for listening. And I would love to hear your questions, should you have any.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got some questions from the audience. Have you got any, Almira?
Yes, sorry, I was just finding a quiet place. I'm sitting with my boys, so excuse the shout earlier. So, Eleanor, just from my side as well, thank you very much. That was really cool. And the boys enjoyed it thoroughly as well. So, the first one we have is, does being unpalatable help the individual insect or only on the population level? For example, do individual insects have to sacrifice themselves and their genes by being eaten in order that others of the species are protected?
Yes, so that does seem to be the case, that particularly with cases where a predator has to learn to avoid a individual, they have to learn somehow. So in some cases you do get species which are the predator learns. However, also on top of that, you get a lot of fascinating crossover between the colours of different species, which, so, you know, in one area you may have a few toxic species which all kind of adopt. So yes, there does appear to be a cost when the behavior has to be learnt, but the invertebrates and other animals are very have adapted in many ways in which this won't have as much of an impact on the population as they might expect. But yeah, really good question.
Not mine, but thank you very much for that good answer. I've got one other one, and it's on what I'll try and pronounce, aposematism.
Yep.
How do birds teach their young which colored caterpillars to avoid eating? Is that an innate aspect, or do they have to get taught?
That is a really good question. That is a very good question, to which I honestly don't know the answer, but I think that is a really, really interesting question. I did some work with Dr. Umbers on the Australian magpies, and in those cases, we were trying to test whether or not the juveniles who had just hatched, whether or not they would react to these mountain katydids or not. And it was quite interesting, trials in the wild, to make sure that they couldn't see the parents, because in certain species, like these Australian magpies, they're very, very clever and they very quickly mimic each other. So I wouldn't be surprised if in cases like that, where you have you know, very intelligent animals that learn from each other very quickly, I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't some learning that went on in those cases. But I could imagine there's also an element of individuals trying it and then discovering that it's not a very good idea. But that's a really, really good question too. And I'm sure there needs to be more research into it as well.
Yeah, I think the big challenge is not being invasive when you're doing it and trying to be around to see what happens when their eyesight's so good and their hearing. So no, thank you very much. That's the questions from my side. Any of the other Q&A team?
I haven't got any, but I have got one of my own. I don't really know much about insects and different things, but I was wondering, was there any colours that are more predominant than others with the camouflage and the mimicry?
Oh, that's a really good question. So yeah, good question. So I'd say that there are certain colours that kind of classically crop up all the time in terms of warning coloration. So you have a lot of reds and you have a lot of yellows and you have a lot of oranges. So they tend to be kind of across the board, kind of a warning signal, which is found in things like frogs as well as things like invertebrates as well. In terms of coloration for camouflage, I think it largely depends on the environment in which the animal is trying to hide in. So there's a really lovely example in the peppered moths, which I'm sure many of you on this call have probably heard about before, in which you had a lot more peppered moths when there was a lot of air pollution causing a lot of the trees and the buildings to be dark colours. You had a lot of these dark coloured moths. But when the air was cleaner and there was less soot around, you got more and more of the light coloured moths. So yeah, again, a really good question. Thank you.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I haven't got any more questions.
I've got a few. I think they're coming through now. First one is from Molly, and she is asking how you got into this sort of research, Eleanor.
That is also a very good question. Well, my degree is actually in, I started my degree in medical sciences, but I have always been very, very keen on invertebrates. I've always pursued entomology in my spare time, and I came across an opportunity to apply for a grant to go to a jungle to study bugs, which, because I really love bugs, is I decided to do just in a summer holiday as an undergraduate. And that's really opened so many doors to me, and really got me completely hooked on studying invertebrates forever, hopefully. So yes, I feel like many fields, entomology has loads of different pathways into it. So even if you're studying a degree that isn't directly linked to entomology, that doesn't mean that you can't end up going into entomology later on.
That's great, thank you. Reese has sent me two questions that are sort of linked. The first is quite a broad one. Is there an explanation for the altruism seen in the natural world? And then I suppose following on from that, are there any examples of cheaters who would use the warning coloration for obviously not very nice reasons, I suppose?
Yeah, so yes, both of these are really good questions. Altruism is a tricky one for me. I don't think I have a good answer to the altruism one. My main study species is woodlice, and they don't really show any altruistic behaviour, so I'm afraid I'm not very well up on understanding the current theories behind altruism, but that is a really interesting question, which I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to. The other one was on, sorry, what was the second one on? It was on...
whether there are any examples of cheaters that would show the warning coloration but not actually be bad for the prey, predators.
Yeah. Yes, there totally are, and it's a really interesting area. It's a form of mimicry in which you have certain individuals who will, as you say, mimic the toxic individuals, despite the fact that they have absolutely no toxins themselves. But obviously, this is something that's really bad for the toxic individuals. You don't want predators to start thinking that some of them are not toxic. So what ends up happening is this incredible, almost arms race in which the toxic individuals will evolve to be different to the non-toxic individuals. And then the non-toxic individuals will then evolve to try and be more like the toxic individuals, so the predators still can't tell them apart. And it seems to be the case that this is perhaps happening in not just their colours, but perhaps also in other elements, like the way that they fly, or perhaps even the pheromones they give off, this kind of incredible arms race between the two. But what makes it even more complicated is that you have one species, say, which is toxic, they want to be similar to a second species, which is toxic, to help predators distinguish between them. But then they also don't want to be like the non-toxic ones. So there's this very complicated evolutionary arm race going on, which is just absolutely fascinating to study. So yes, everyone should study it. It's great.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I've got one more from Holly that says, if vampire bats are moved to light conditions, can they then do normal ink, or are they only able to do light?
No, so yes, this is another really interesting question as well. They're just incredible creatures, but they don't have the ability to produce ink. They've actually lost that whole ability because they've just adapted to solely live in this dark kind of underwater world. There's lots of other suggestions of other things that they do behavior-wise, but in terms of producing ink, that's one of the things that they can't do. But they're fascinating species nonetheless. And what an amazing evolutionary change to start producing this sticky, glowing goo, really. It's just remarkable. But yeah, really good question.
Brilliant, thank you very much. There is a question from Henrietta. I'm not sure if Henrietta wants to take that for herself and ask, or...
Oh, hi, Lana. Yeah, presentation. Yeah, so my question was about some of these insects that have evolved to mimic a very specific species of flower. So what I'm wondering about is, you know, with climate change and species becoming more or less abundant all the time, what happens to the insect if the particular species of flower that they're resembling becomes extinct?
So good question. So in terms of the orchid mantis that we spoke about, it appears that they kind of generalize, so they kind of look like a lot of flowers. So I would expect that they would be able to cope so long as the vegetation didn't change too much. But you're totally right that there is a real problem between, you know, certain invertebrates being specific for different plants. Like, for example, you have certain, this is very nerdy, but very interesting in my opinion. But you have certain insects who have longer mouth parts than others, allowing them to feed from really long flowers rather than short flowers. And one of the problems is that flowers that are long for a invertebrate to get to, or short, can flower at slightly different times, which means that with our current changing weather patterns, one of the things that we are seeing is some cases where the flowers don't flower at exactly the right time, and so you get kind of certain invertebrates kind of missing the points at which the flowers which are most beneficial for them are flowering. So that is a real problem, the kind of changing landscape, and what impacts that will have on invertebrates is a really big problem. So yeah, that's a really good question.
Oh, thank you. And I can see actually another question that's come in. This is from Andrew. So he's asking, has anyone done any research into whether the genes for these traits are more variable than other genes? So can these genes mutate quickly?
Oh, that's a very good question. So whether or not the genes for kind of color and things like that can mutate more quickly than others, that is a very good question to which I don't know the answer. I think that is a really, really interesting research question to which I don't know the answer. I would expect that maybe they would, but I wouldn't be able to tell you a definitive answer. I do know that there's an amazing lab in Cambridge run by Professor Jiggins, and he's done a lot of looking at the kind of nitty-gritty of the genetics behind particularly toxic butterflies and how they change. So I'd very much recommend looking up his work, as I'm sure it'll be much more informative than anything that I could say. But yeah, that is a really interesting question. Thank you.
I've got one more question that's come through, if that's okay.
Yeah, totally.
From Molly, and she's asking, what is your favourite example of aposematism?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I haven't thought about that. I've got so many favorites. invertebrates? That's a really lovely question. Thank you very much for asking me that. I guess that the one that springs to mind just now is from talking about the bioluminescent millipedes. I just think that that is a really unusual way of thinking about aposematism, and not one that I'd come across before kind of researching this talk, particularly given the fact that we tend to think of aposematism in terms of colors that we see during the day. It's really interesting to start thinking about that as something which happens at night. And it raises a lot of other really interesting questions about, you know, okay, we have these colors which are aposematic, but perhaps we have something similar which is happening with smell or with sounds or other things, is kind of like warning, which is, to me, they're just a really interesting example about, you know, how a defense can happen in a way that we might not be expecting. Also, another fascinating thing about them is their brightness, and the level at which they glow directly is an indicator of how toxin the individual is. So you might have a group of them, some of which are glowing more brightly or less brightly, and it kind of directly shows how toxic they are, which is just a remarkable adaptation, and still no one really knows why. So thank you. That's a really great question. I have many favorites, but that's just the one that springs to mind, I guess, because I've been talking about it, but they are fascinating creatures.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions at all for Eleanor?
Yeah, I got two just come in. They're both from Akifa. And the first one is, when some bugs show aposematism and the other one mimics it, but aren't actually toxic, how does that bug know to evolve into this coloration?
Oh, that is a lovely question. Okay, that's a really, really great question. So I would say that the thing would be that the bug doesn't know. So this is all happening at level. I just think this is a great question on many levels. It's a really good question. First of all, does an animal know that it's colourful? Which is a really big question in itself, and has a lot of implications to how does invertebrates background match? You know, how does a green animal know to stay on a green background, or how does a crab know to change colour to a particular background? And an animal knowing whether or not an invertebrate knows what it is still something that we still don't understand, and I find absolutely fascinating. But then the second part of your question about how does it know to evolve to be a little bit different, the suggestion would be that it wouldn't know to evolve. What would be happening would be a kind of a form of selection, in which you would have presumably, say for example, you have a mimic who is not toxic, a species of mimic who is not toxic, who is kind of a little bit yellow. And it would mean that the species that are not toxic, who are a little bit yellow, would put at risk the toxic ones who are also a little bit yellow. Whereas the toxic ones who happen to just be a little bit more yellow, you would presume that perhaps the predator would avoid them more because they're less similar to the mimic. And so in that way, you could get predators selectively attacking individuals who are more similar to the mimic, but less similar to the more extreme edges of the actual poisonous creature, which could drive evolution in that way. So in terms of thinking about it, it's to think about what's happening at the population level and what's happening at the perspective of the predator, rather than the individual invertebrate. But both parts of those questions, I think, are really, really interesting. Thank you very much for asking them.
Kifa has also got another question, and it says, has the orchid mantis evolved from general mantises we see, i.e. the green ones?
Oh, this is a really good question. To be honest, I don't know. I would assume that they had, but I don't know very much about the evolution of orchid mantises. In fact, they have been, very little research has been done on them. In fact, I could only find a very few papers when I was doing my research for this talk about their behaviour. So it wouldn't surprise me if their entire family tree is not fully known. So I can't give you a very good answer to that, but I would say that they're probably more closely related than the green mantises than other groups of invertebrate, but exactly how they evolved, I don't know. But I would absolutely love to know. I think that's a really fascinating question. Thank you.
And I got another question that's just come in from Lindsay Martin. Some of the creatures see very differently than we do. Are you, is their movement in the study field starting to use technology such as cameras that pick up different, wider spectrums in order to investigate things from that perspective?
Yes, definitely. So yes, again, a really important question, thinking about how predators are perceiving the prey, because it's all very well us looking at a particular animal and being like, oh yeah, I can't see it, whereas actually its prey is a crayfish or something, which has a very visual system. So yes, that is a really, really great question. And in fact, I was working with a really good research team before, and what they were doing is they had a really interesting computer program that essentially shifted all of the colors to colors as a bird would see it. So you could take a picture of an invertebrate, for example, and then put it through this computer program, and then it would show it to you as a bird would see it. And then what's more, what they could do then is kind of pick out the bits as highlighted by this computer program, which were perhaps more or less obvious to the bird. So yes, using computer programs to work out whether or not something is going to be conspicuous or not to the correct predator is a really important thing that a lot of research groups are doing. But having said that, though, sometimes it can be quite difficult to tell what the predator of a particular animal is, or even to tell what the visual system of that particular animal is. So yes, it is being used, and it's a really important part of the field now. But at the same time, there are still challenges, like not being able to know exactly what a predator is seeing. But yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. That was really interesting. That's all the questions from me at the moment.
Okay, great. So for those of you who are not members of the RSB, if you wanted to join at all, I'm just putting a link in the chat now. And there's also a link for a Survey Monkey questionnaire just on how you think the event went. And I'll hand you back to Henrietta now.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to thank Eleanor Drinkwater for her wonderful and very, very colourful presentation, and also for answering so many questions. Of course, thanks also to my Royal Society of Biology South Wales branch committee members who've been fielding the questions and handling the technical aspects from behind the scenes. And again, thank you also to the Linnaean Society for their support. Finally, of course, thank you to everyone who's attended, and particularly those who've submitted such thought-provoking questions. We do really appreciate if you can fill in the survey that's in the chat, as that really helps us with planning future events. We do have a number of other online events that we're currently planning on a whole range of different biological topics, and these will be advertised on the Royal Society of Biology website as soon as these are available for booking. So thank you again to everybody. I hope to see you at another event soon, and have a very good night. Thank you.